The story of Robin Hood. The tales of Robin Hood have been told around the campfires since the days when good King Richard the Lionheart ruled England. This is the story of how Robin Hood got his name, for he was not born with it. Robin was called Robert when he lived with his father and mother in a farmhouse called Locksley Farm. It stood at the edge of a great forest in the centre of England. In those far-off days, much of England was covered by forest in which the deer roamed wild. The nearest city to Locksley Farm was Nottingham. It stands today, but of the great Sherwood Forest there is not much left to see. When young Robert was but a lad, his mother died. Robert and his father were left to work the farm with the help of half a dozen workers. Robert's father had been a soldier before he married. He'd gone abroad to fight for his king, and his gallantry in battle had been rewarded when the king gave him Locksley Farm to live on. There, as well as learning how to farm the land, Robert of Locksley learned how to use the weapons his father knew so well: the sword, the quarterstaff, and the longbow. Young Robert learned quickly and well, and when he was only in his teens, he often won contests with the bow and arrow, which was his favourite weapon. In those days, there were many fairs where contests with the bow and arrow were very popular. At the age of 16, Robert won a contest at the great fair in Nottingham. Many highly trained soldiers competed against others, so it was a great success indeed when Robert won. It was then that his father said to him, "I believe one day the world will hear of you, my lad." But it was not as young Robert of Locksley Farm that the world would hear of him, and as yet no one had ever heard the name Robin Hood. King Richard the Lionheart went away with an army to fight in foreign lands. He left his brother, Prince John, to rule England until he returned. Prince John was a weak man who allowed the barons and the earls and greedy churchmen to grow rich at the expense of the poor. They taxed the people heavily, and when they couldn't pay, they took their lands and their farms. England was no longer a happy place to live when King Richard was away. There came a day when Robert's father died, and he was left to work the farm. He and the men who helped him worked hard, so they did not fall into debt. But many did, and it was common to see beggars and tramps on the roads and in the forests. They'd been honest men, but they'd lost their homes. Robin was walking through Sherwood Forest one day, on his way back to Locksley from Nottingham, when he chanced to see a deer standing in a clearing amongst the trees. Almost as soon as he saw it, to Robin's surprise, it dropped dead, shot through the heart with an arrow. Robin expected a soldier or one of the rich knights who hunted in the forest had shot the deer. But then he saw who it was. An old man, almost in rags, clutching his homemade bow, ran to the fallen deer and began to cut it into pieces. He worked quickly and quietly, for it was against the law to shoot the king's deer, and he knew it. Robin knew that too. He knew that if anyone saw the old man, he would be put into prison and maybe put to death. Robin crept up to him. "Don't you know it's against the law to kill deer in the forest?" he said, looking grim. The old man turned swiftly. "Are you going to arrest me?" he asked. "No, I'm not," said Robin, "but you'd better come with me, and quickly too, for if you are caught, you know what will happen to you." So the two men went together to Locksley Farm, carrying the deer with them. But later that day, a gamekeeper happened to see bloodstains, and he followed them to Locksley. Then he ran to tell his master, the Sheriff of Nottingham, who was no friend of Robin's. It wasn't long before soldiers arrived at the farm, accompanied by a wicked nobleman, Sir Guy of Gisborne, a friend of the sheriff. Sir Guy of Gisborne had had his eye on Locksley Farm for a long time, and now he believed the chance had come to take it. He intended to arrest Robin for killing a deer in the forest, and then to steal his farm. But Robin had seen the soldiers coming. Before they arrived to hammer on the door, Robin and the old man and all his workmen had left the house. Now they stood in the forest, all of them with their bows and arrows ready aimed at Sir Guy and his soldiers. "Are you looking for me?" Robin called out. Sir Guy spun round on his horse. He saw the men facing him with their bows drawn. Robin had his own bow in his hand, but he had not drawn it. "I have come to arrest you, Robert of Locksley," Sir Guy shouted, "for the crime of killing a royal deer in the forest." Robin laughed in his face. "You'll arrest nobody this day," he called out, "and unless you and your men throw down their weapons before I count 5, you'll never again arrest anyone." Robin began to count loudly. 1, 2, 3. There was a clatter as swords and staffs and crossbows fell to the ground. Robin went towards Sir Guy and his men, followed by his own men who kept their bows drawn. "And now," laughed Robin, "since all of you have nicer clothes than we have, I think we'll have a change." Later that day, Sir Guy of Gisborne arrived back at his castle wearing the rough and simple clothes of a peasant, and all his men were the same. Meanwhile, Robin had taken from the farm all the things he thought he would need, for he knew that Sir Guy would be back, and with many more soldiers. In the forest, Robin stood on a hillock and spoke to his men. "For what we've done this day, my lads, we will all be classed as outlaws with a price on our heads. There's no justice in England now with our good King Richard away, and I'm sure that Sir Guy of Gisborne and his friends will not rest until we're dead. Well, for my part, if I'm to be an outlaw, then I will enjoy the life. This forest will protect us from attack, and there's food here for those who know where to look for it. And because there's no justice in this land, I declare it will be my chosen duty to fight for it. I will take from the rich and give to the poor, and I will defend any man who suffers from these greedy noblemen, who will suffer themselves when King Richard the Lionheart returns. Will you join with me?" A mighty shout of loyalty went up in the forest. Those became the first of Robin's merry men, and many more were to follow. Robin always wore a suit of Lincoln green with a hood, and so he became known everywhere as Robin Hood. His adventures have become famous the whole world over. The story of King Arthur. King Uther of Britain had been ill for many, many months. Meanwhile, his enemies had become very strong and had defeated his army in a great battle. So Merlin, one of his wise men, suggested that the king should be carried to the field of battle so that his presence might bring victory to his men. It brought victory, but a victory for which the king had to pay dearly. He now was very ill, and the news travelled through the castle that indeed he was dying. For the last 3 days and nights, King Uther had been speechless, and as yet he had not named the person who was to succeed him on the throne. So the barons went to Merlin to ask his advice. He told them to assemble in the king's chamber at the same hour the next day, and by the grace of God, he would ask the king to name his successor to the throne. Next day, at the appointed hour, all the barons, together with Merlin, came to the king's chamber. When the door was closed behind them, Merlin drew down the cloak from his face and looked at the gathered barons and the weeping queen. "The king is still alive?" he asked. "He is still alive, only just," answered one of the barons. Merlin went up to the king's bed, and a cloud gathered in his eyes. "It is the will of all," he said, turning to the queen and the barons, "that I make the king speak. Shall he name the one who is to succeed him?" "It is our will," said the barons, and the queen too said, "It is our will." Merlin covered his eyes for a moment, and then, turning towards the bed, he said to the king, "Sire, is it your will that your baby son Arthur be king after you?" These words were scarcely uttered when King Uther replied, without a halt in his speech, "It is my earnest wish and desire. I give him God's blessing and mine." The king had hardly finished these words when his breath went from him and he died. For a long time after King Uther's death, the country was in great confusion, for every powerful noble wanted to make himself king. So Merlin took his baby son to be looked after by a loyal knight, Sir Ector. Then, many years later, when Arthur was 15 years old, Merlin went to the Archbishop of Canterbury and asked him to give word to all the lords of the kingdom and the gentlemen of arms to meet in London at Christmas and join in prayer to God, so that he would reveal the rightful king. On Christmas Day the lords gathered, together with the common people, in St. Paul's and prayed long and earnestly to be given a sign by God. When the service was over, they all went out into the churchyard, and there they saw a curious sight. A square of stone lay before them, and in the stone there was an anvil, and through the anvil and the stone there was a sword. On the sword was written in golden letters, "This sword is called Excalibur. He who pulleth this sword out of this stone and anvil is the rightly born King of England." When the lords saw these words, they tried, one after the other, to pull out the sword, but no one was able to move it from its place.
"He is not here,"
the archbishop said,
"but I do not doubt that God will make him known to us."
They agreed to meet on a future day and let any man try his skill at withdrawing the sword. The archbishop arranged a tournament for New Year's Day, and until the king was revealed, the lords and commons should not be separated. So, on New Year's Day, the lords came together. Among them rode Sir Ector, the noble knight who had loved King Uther well, and in his company was his son, Sir Kay, and young Arthur, his adopted son. As they rode to the tournament, Sir Kay discovered that he'd left his sword behind at their lodging, and so he asked young Arthur to ride back and fetch it for him. "Right gladly," said the boy. "Haste on with your father. I will return to the town with all speed and bring your sword." When he reached their lodging, he knocked on the door, but no one answered, for everybody had gone to the tournament. Arthur was angry and said to himself, "I will ride to the churchyard and take the sword from the stone, for I do not wish my brother to be without a sword on this special day." When he came to the churchyard, he lightly pulled the sword out of the stone and rode as fast as he could back to Sir Kay and gave it to him. Sir Kay was well pleased. He looked at it and knew it was the sword from the stone. He ran to rejoin his father and tell him the news. "Sir," he cried to his father, "surely I, and no other, am chosen to be King of England, since in my hand I bear the sword of the stone." Sir Ector led his son and the boy Arthur back to the church and commanded his own son to tell him truly how he'd got the sword. Sir Kay's face fell, but he answered sternly, "My brother Arthur brought it to me." Sir Ector turned to the boy. "Tell me, Arthur, did you pluck the sword from the stone?" Arthur at once confessed that he did. "Was no one there," asked Sir Ector, "to forbid you?" "No," said the boy. "Everyone had gone to the tournament." Then Sir Ector said, "I know well now you must be king of the land." "But how can I be king?" Arthur asked. "It was clearly ordained," Sir Ector replied, "for the man who can draw the sword out of the stone shall be rightful king of this land. Now tell me, see if you can put the sword back in the stone and pull it out again." "That is easy," said Arthur, and he put it back in the stone. Then Sir Ector turned to his son, Sir Kay, and said, "Now you, my son, draw out the sword." As much as Sir Kay tried, he could not withdraw it. "Let me try," said Sir Ector, and laying his hands on it, he pulled and pulled, but the sword would not move in its place. "Now you shall try again," Sir Ector told Arthur. And Arthur laid his hands on it, and the sword slid away from the stone as effortlessly as a sunbeam across a wall. When he replaced it, it stuck as securely as before. Sir Ector and Sir Kay then knelt before him.
"My dear father and brother," young Arthur cried, "why do you kneel?"
"By King Uther's wish you were entrusted to me," Sir Ector said to the boy. "I am not your father. You are of higher birth than I thought." Then he told Arthur that Merlin had brought him to his wife to be nurtured and raised until the time came when he would receive his kingdom. Arthur was very sad when he heard that Sir Ector was not his father, but Sir Ector cheered him up and said that when he was king he should make Sir Kay steward of all his lands. "That shall be done," promised Arthur. And straightway they went to the archbishop, who was struck with great wonder at hearing their story. But he advised that nothing should be said of the matter, for soon it was 12th day, when every man would try his skill at the sword. On 12th day all the barons gathered in the churchyard, but no one except Arthur was able to pull the sword out. Many of the lords were angry and said it was a great shame that the kingdom should be governed by a boy of low birth. The archbishop ordered the trial to be put off till Candlemas. At Candlemas, young Arthur was again the only one who could withdraw the sword. The barons began to quarrel and demanded a new trial at Easter. At Easter, the same thing happened, whereupon the matter was delayed till Pentecost. At Pentecost, Arthur once again pulled out the sword which would not yield to anyone else. The commons then rose and cried, "Arthur shall be our king. Hath not the sword revealed him to us in the voice of God? We will have no other, and no further delay in the matter. Those who stand up against him we will slay." And so young Arthur was proclaimed king of the realm of England, as revealed by God in his answer to earnest prayer. Arthur laid the sword upon the altar. Then the archbishop crowned him king, and Arthur swore unto his lords and commons to be a true king and to do justice to the end of his days. The story of King Arthur's dream. A quarrel between King Arthur and Sir Launcelot, one of the bravest knights of the Round Table, became so bitter that Sir Launcelot left King Arthur's court and went to France, taking with him all his followers. After some time, King Arthur decided to raise a large army and go and fight Sir Launcelot. Before he left for France, he appointed his nephew, Sir Modred, to be chief ruler of England in his absence. Sir Modred, however, proved unfaithful to the trust committed to him, and in a short time gave word that King Arthur had been killed in battle with Sir Launcelot. He then summoned the Parliament and made it appoint him king, and so he was crowned at Canterbury. But one day word was brought to Sir Modred that King Arthur was coming home with his army to punish him. Sir Modred therefore gathered his own army and marched to Dover. He made great efforts to prevent King Arthur from landing in his own kingdom, but he was driven back, and he and his army were defeated. King Arthur was much grieved after the battle had finished to find his beloved nephew, Sir Gawain, dying in a boat. "Sir Gawain," cried King Arthur, "my sister's son, here you lie, the man I loved most in the whole world. I've also lost Sir Launcelot, so now there is no joy left for me on earth." Sir Gawain answered weakly, "My death is now at hand, and it is due to my own rashness and wilfulness." Then Sir Gawain implored the king to send for Sir Launcelot and esteem him above all other knights. A little while later Sir Gawain died, and the king gave orders for him to be buried in a chapel within Dover Castle.
Immediately afterwards, at the head of his army, the king marched to Barham Down, where a great battle took place. Again Sir Modred was defeated, and he and his army fled to Canterbury. As a result of this victory, many people rejoined King Arthur. It was arranged that a new battle should take place on a level stretch of ground near Salisbury. Sir Modred strengthened his army, and those who were in favour of Sir Launcelot also joined his side. On the night before the battle, King Arthur had a strange dream. Sir Gawain came to him and warned him to put off the battle. "If you fight tomorrow," Sir Gawain said, "you and a great many of your followers will be killed. But if you put off the battle for a month, then Sir Launcelot and all his knights will come to your assistance, and you will win the battle with Sir Modred." The king called his knights and lords and told them of his vision. They agreed that 2 nobles and 2 bishops should go to Sir Modred and try to make a truce with him for a month. The next morning, when the armies stood face to face, Sir Modred sent word to King Arthur, asking him to meet him on a ground in full view of either army, and each should bring with him 14 knights. The king agreed to this. Before going, the king told his army that if they saw any sword drawn, they were to come immediately and kill the traitor Sir Modred. Sir Modred gave the same orders to his army. "If you see any sword drawn," he told them, "come and slay everyone that stands before you, for I have no faith in this truce." The 2 leaders spoke to each other and came to an agreement. Then they sat down and took some refreshment. Suddenly an adder came out of a bush and stung one of the knights in the foot. He immediately drew his sword and killed the adder. As soon as the 2 armies saw the sword drawn, they blew trumpets and horns and started to shout. Before anything could be done, a fierce fight broke out, which lasted until sunset. Many were killed on both sides, and King Arthur was very grieved to see the field covered with the dead bodies of so many brave men. Of King Arthur's army, only the king himself and 2 of his knights survived. They were Sir Lucan and his brother Sir Bedivere. "Where are all my noble knights?" the king cried, looking around him, "that I should have lived to see such a sad day. Now I must soon die, but first I wish to punish the traitor Sir Modred, who has caused all this bloodshed." Looking up, King Arthur saw Sir Modred leaning on his sword beside his dead men. "Give me my sword from the stone, Excalibur," the king said to Sir Lucas, "for there I see the traitor." The 2 knights reminded the king of Sir Gawain's warning, but the king would not be deterred. Brandishing his sword, he ran towards Sir Modred, crying, "Traitor, now your death day has come." Seeing King Arthur's fury, Sir Modred brandished his own sword and ran towards him, but the king's sword pierced his body first. And when he felt the deadly wound, Sir Modred struck his sword at the side of King Arthur's head. Sir Modred fell dead to the ground, and King Arthur fainted beside him. The king's 2 faithful knights, Sir Lucan and Sir Bedivere, raised him from the ground and quickly carried him to a little chapel not far from the seaside. "It is best," Sir Lucan said to the king, "that we should take you to a town." But the king said, "I cannot stand. My head aches too much." The 2 knights tried to lift the king to his feet, but he fainted again, and Sir Lucan, in the heavy effort, fell to the ground and died on the spot. The king, on recovering his senses, mourned the death of so brave a knight, and Sir Bedivere wept for his dead brother. "Do not mourn," the king told him. "It is no good to me or to this brave knight. My time on earth is passing fast. Therefore take my good sword and go with it to the waterside. When you come to it, throw it in the water, and then return to me and tell me what you have seen." "My lord," Sir Bedivere said, "your command shall be obeyed." And he departed. But as he walked along, he noticed that the sword was set with precious stones. "If I throw this sword into the water," he said to himself, "no good will come, but only harm and loss." So he hid the sword under a tree and returned to the king and told him that he had thrown it into the water. "What, then, did you see?" the king asked. "Sir, I saw nothing but the rippling of the waves," Sir Bedivere replied. "That cannot be true," King Arthur said. "Therefore, if you love and honor me, go again and do as I command you." Sir Bedivere went again and took the sword in his hand, and once more he thought it a shame to throw it away. So he hid it and returned to the king and told him that he had obeyed his command. "What, then, did you see?" asked the king. "Sir, I saw nothing but the rippling of the waves and heard only the moaning of the winds," Sir Bedivere replied. "That cannot be true," the king said. "Twice you have deceived me. Who would have thought that a knight so noble can betray me because of a rich sword? Go again and throw the sword into the water. Do not delay. My death is approaching. If you do not do as I ask, I shall slay you with my own hands." Sir Bedivere went again and took the sword in his hand, and this time he threw it with all his might far out into the water. Suddenly a hand rose from the water and caught the sword. It shook it 3 times, and then drew it underneath the surface. Sir Bedivere returned to the king and told him what he had seen. "Ah," the king cried, "help me now from this place, for I fear I have stayed too long." Sir Bedivere lifted the king onto his back and gently carried him to the waterside. As they approached the water's edge, a small barge with many fair ladies in it drew towards them. They were wearing black hoods, and when they saw King Arthur, they cried and wailed. "Now lift me into the barge," King Arthur ordered Sir Bedivere. 3 ladies, wearing crowns of gold, took the king and laid him on the deck, his head resting on the lap of one of them. "Oh, dear brother," she said, "why have you waited so long? This wound on your head is almost cold." They began to row gently away from the land, and Sir Bedivere was left standing on the shore. "Oh, my lord Arthur," he called out, "what shall become of me now that you have gone and left me alone among my enemies?" "You must comfort yourself," the king said. "I cannot help you as much as I would like to, for I am going to the Vale of Avalon to heal myself of my grievous wound. If you do not hear of me again, do not forget King Arthur." As the barge moved slowly out of sight, Sir Bedivere stood watching. Then he ran weeping into the forest.
Story of Midas, the king who loved gold. Once there was a king who loved gold more than anything else in the world. His name was King Midas. He began to collect gold when he was a very young king, newly on the throne. By the time he was middle-aged, he'd filled up all the cellars of his palace with the gold. He'd even ordered all the wine to be moved out of the royal wine cellars so that they could be used to store gold. The royal kitchens were used too. The poor cooks had to manage as best they could with crates of gold all over the place. At first, nobody had minded very much when the king began to collect the gold, but when every cupboard, every drawer, every cellar, and even the spare bedrooms were all packed tight with the king's gold, his servants began to grumble. You may not know it, but there is a kind of fairy who hears all the grumbles in this world. Just as there is a fairy who hears all the wishes, so there is the grumble fairy. He doesn't look very much like a fairy, but that's not surprising with his job to do. He's quite small, about as big as a pint pot. He always wears a green suit with yellow boots and a red hat. He can't fly, but he can appear and disappear just like magic. And being so small, he very often isn't noticed. The grumble fairy began to hear all the grumbles coming from the royal palace. First he heard a lot coming from the royal kitchens, But he didn't bother too much about that, because people who work in kitchens are always grumbling. But when grumbles started to come from such places as the royal wine cellars, the royal gardens, and the royal dining hall, the Grumble Fairy knew that he would have to do something. The first thing he did was to appear like magic in one of the wine cellars where the king was admiring his store of gold. The king was far too busy to even notice the Grumble Fairy, who was sitting on top of one of the boxes. He saw the king sitting on a huge pile of gold coins, picking up handfuls and sighing with contentment. Gold, gold, lovely, lovely gold, was all he kept saying to himself, for to be sure he thought he was alone. The Grumble Fairy gave a polite cough. The king didn't hear that one, so the Grumble Fairy coughed again, a little louder this time. This time the king did hear, and he was very surprised to find anyone but himself in the cellar. He was even more surprised to see it was the Grumble Fairy. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I haven't been grumbling. Indeed, I've never felt less like grumbling." The Grumble Fairy nodded his head. "I know you haven't," he said, "but have you noticed that everyone about you has been grumbling lately?" "No," replied the king. "What are they grumbling about?" "It's you," said the Grumble Fairy. "You and your gold. You're driving everybody crazy. Your cooks are grumbling, your gardeners are grumbling, your servants are grumbling, and even your beautiful daughter, Princess Astra, has been grumbling." "My daughter?" asked the king. "What has she to grumble about?" "Did you not order one of the maids to store a crate under the princess's bed?" asked the Grumble Fairy. "Well, the princess is cross because it makes her mattress all lumpy, and gold, my dear king, is rather hard, as you know." "Oh dear," the king said. "I'll have to have it moved when I can think of somewhere to move it, but as you can see, I'm rather full." "Nevertheless," said the Grumble Fairy, "I think you would still like to collect more gold. Isn't that true?" "Yes, indeed," replied the king. "More and more and more." "Really?" said the Grumble Fairy, smiling secretly. "I wonder if you would like it if I cast a magic spell, and then everything you touched would turn to gold." "Nothing would please me more," said the king. "In that case," said the Grumble Fairy, "it will be done." And he immediately cast the spell. "From the very first moment you wake in the morning, everything you touch will turn to gold." Next morning, the king awoke to see the sun shining. He remembered the magic spell and decided to try it out. A maid had left a cup of tea by the bedside. The king touched the cup, and it turned into solid gold. He was delighted. But when he tried to drink the tea, he found that that had turned into solid gold too. Next, he reached for his biscuit. That turned to gold. The king began to wonder. He jumped out of bed and reached for his slippers. They were very uncomfortable. Then he grabbed his dressing gown and found that a solid gold dressing gown just cannot be worn. Just then, his manservant entered with a tray holding the king's favourite breakfast, tea and toast and a boiled egg. The manservant set down the tray and left without a word. Gingerly, the king reached out for the tray. In the twinkling of an eye, the whole tray turned into a golden ornament. A golden tray, a golden egg, and worst of all, golden toast. The king was terribly upset. Now he knew why the Grumble Fairy had smiled a secret smile. This wasn't at all what the king had had in his mind. He knew now that he had been tricked. He began to cry. "Astra, come and help," he called out. Princess Astra heard the cry and rushed into her father's room. He was sitting on the bed, looking at his hands. Princess Astra had never seen her father so upset, so she rushed to him, and he put his arms round her. "Oh, my dear," he cried, "something awful has happened." And then, with horror, he felt his lovely daughter go suddenly cold. And when he looked up, he saw that she had turned into a golden statue. The king was so sorry for himself, that he threw himself down on the bed and sobbed and sobbed. The bed turned to gold. Horrid, hard, cold gold. The king was in misery. But the Grumble Fairy had heard. Suddenly he was in the king's bedroom, sitting merrily on an ornament on the table. "I suppose now you want me to cast another spell," he said. "Oh, yes, please," begged the king. "Please help me." Fortunately, the Grumble Fairy could cast the perfect spell to uncast the spell which the king had asked for before. "Now all you have to do is to touch all the things you touched before," he said. In no time at all, Princess Astra was normal again, and so was the breakfast tray. So they had a piece of toast each, and shared the egg. "I know now," said the king, "that some things are better than gold, especially you, my love."